I'm Brian Dawkins from the Rio Grande Valley Church of Christ in Berlin, and this is Give Me the Bible.
No matter how much experience you have with the Bible, you've probably encountered parts that are confusing. Maybe you haven't wanted to read the Bible because you're sure it will be too hard to understand. I've been reading the Bible my whole life. I've been confused. Some parts still confuse me. But I do believe that it's less confusing than we tend to think. I want to show you how much of the Bible you probably understand already and make a serious dent in demystifying the rest. First, let's think about the Bible as being made of basically three kinds of writings: law, narrative, and poetry. Everything in Scripture can fall into these categories. Two of these are especially easy to understand. The first one is the law. We're probably thinking first about the law of Moses, but I'll also include most of the New Testament letters in this category. By law, I'm referring to everything in Scripture that's either telling you what to do, what not to do, or what to do when you did what you shouldn't. We don't tend to struggle with the laws. In fact, some people might wish we only had the laws. At least then we'd know exactly what we are supposed to do. The second type of writing we'll consider is narrative or story. We don't often struggle to understand stories. What Bible stories do you think of first? Maybe you're thinking of the story of Jesus' birth, or his miracles, or his death, burial, and resurrection. Maybe you're thinking about Daniel in the lion's den, or David and Goliath, or Noah's Ark. These are all stories. They're true stories, to be sure, but they're stories. Stories tell us what did happen, what could happen, or what will happen. Think about one of those Bible stories again. You understand what the story says, don't you? I'm not asking if you understand exactly how everything in the story happened. I'm not even asking if you believe everything in the story happened. I hope you do. I'm just asking if you understand the sequence of events. God told Noah exactly how to build an ark: to bring animals into the ark in pairs, then to go into the ark with his wife, his 3 sons, and his 3 daughters-in-law, and then God shut them in. Then God caused it to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. When the floodwaters subsided, the ark came to rest on a mountain, and Noah, his family, and all the animals came out of the ark, and God put a rainbow in the sky as a promise that he would never again destroy the world by flood. Not everyone believes the story, but any child can understand the story. This leaves us with poetry. That's the kind of Bible literature that gets us confused more than any other. In the Old Testament, we have a whole section called the books of poetry. But poetry really runs through the entire body of Scripture, from Genesis to Revelation. The prophets most often write in poetry, for example. One of the reasons poetry tends to confuse us more than laws and stories is that poetry is indirect. A poet won't just tell you outright exactly what happened or exactly what to do, at least not often. The first bit of help I want to offer is the perspective that a poem is a story frozen in time. Maybe you struggle with that concept, but just consider how many psalms are reflections about one particularly poignant moment of severe distress or sublime joy. Sometimes we're told what the primary story is, like Psalm 3. You can read in 2 Samuel 15 to 18 about the actual conflict that's going on, but the title of Psalm 3 tells us that it was written by David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Psalm 3 gives you just a snapshot of what that was like for David. Psalm 18, David addressed to the Lord on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from Saul. Again, you can read about David being delivered from all his enemies throughout 1 and 2 Samuel. But in Psalm 18, you get a snapshot of what David felt like when he reflected on that deliverance. Psalm 30, David wrote about the dedication of the temple that he wouldn't even be around to see. Psalm 34, David wrote when he changed his behavior before Abimelech. Again, these are things that you can go in and you can read the story and you can see how these events unfolded. But in the Psalms, David wrote these poems that gives us these snapshots of the emotional and spiritual state that he was in when these things were happening. Sometimes we're not told the story specifically, and yet we can still feel the tension and despair of the moment, like in Psalm 22, where the psalmist feels as though he's surrounded by the strong bulls of Bashan. Sometimes we can feel the serenity of the shepherd king. Maybe he's sitting on a warm glade, considering how his own care for his flock is like the Lord's care for him. Maybe that's going on when David writes Psalm 23. But poetry pulls us into a freeze-frame moment and invites us to look around. As we explore it, we feel the intensity of the moment, but often we're also invited to remember that what we see is only part of the story, and that God is working in and through it all. This is why some of the most miserable psalms remark on God's mercy and goodness, and some of the most euphoric psalms consider God's judgment. Snapshots like this are what poetry does most often, and it's not a useless thought experiment as one might believe. It's in these snapshots that deeper truths about reality are explored and expounded on, and the fact that you might be left with more questions than answers is not a bad thing. It's right that our spiritual growth should lead us deeper into a state of awe and wonder at the great mysteries we don't understand. There's a faithful saying worthy of all acceptance that goes, "The more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know." As we grow, the exercise of our imaginations expand the capacity of our minds. Poetry is where our imaginations are stretched. And the goal of the Christian walk, even of Bible study specifically, isn't to obtain complete knowledge of everything. The point is to understand better the things that we can and to expand our capacity for understanding, to learn total dependence on the only being who does understand everything. Let's think about how this perspective helps us by considering the book of Proverbs, which itself is a snapshot of a historical human story, but it's also a glimpse of the spiritual story playing out beyond what our eyes are allowed to see. In the first 7 verses of Proverbs, Solomon gives a brief statement about why he's compiled all these proverbs. His point is to know wisdom. Then in verse 8, he addresses them directly to his son, who would reign after him. He begins by telling his son about the merits of hearing and learning his father's wisdom, and warn him of the perils of forsaking instruction. Proverbs is the moment in a story where a man who's been filled with all wisdom, the wisest man to ever live, is getting on in years and sits down and thinks about his son who will reign after him. How old do you think his son is when he writes this? Maybe Solomon sees his baby Rehoboam held by his mother in swaddling clothes. Maybe he's a child of 7 or 8 years old in the courtyard playing with wooden swords and shields as Solomon looks down from his window. Maybe Rehoboam's a young man, a teenager being fitted for his first suit of armor. Whatever the case, actually, Solomon at one point looked at his son and thought, "This son of mine is going to rule God's people. I want him to be prepared." So he sits down to write what he hopes his son will take to heart. When he does, he writes about every topic under the sun. He writes about how to handle money, how to treat your neighbors, how to raise children. He writes about marriage. He writes about laziness and work ethic, honesty and compassion. Maybe you're accustomed to going to the book of Proverbs for advice on one of these topics, any of these topics, and you should. But this advice has most to do with becoming the true king of God's people. It's all in the context of an old king instructing his son. When we look at it that way, something comes to the forefront. First of all, yes, there's the instruction on everything that it takes in conduct, character, and habits to run a kingdom and to rule others, how to judge disputes and listen compassionately, how to be fair. And of course, the key to good kingship is faith in God, which is emphasized early and often. But the other thing that comes to the forefront is this major concern that the wise has for his son, the prince, and that is marriage, the choice of a bride. Throughout the book of Proverbs, Solomon is constantly contrasting the true woman against the false woman. We are introduced to each of them in the first two chapters, starting with the Lady Wisdom in chapter 1, verse 20, and then the forbidden woman in chapter 2, verse 16. The true woman is wise, but also virtuous. She's noble, generous, and sensible. The forbidden woman is a harlot. She is seductive, but faithless. She's gluttonous, reckless, foolish. She's attractive, she's an excellent marketer, but her wares are worthless and without substance. Wisdom fills to overflowing, but folly consumes and bankrupts. All through the book of Proverbs, we're running into these two women. Solomon elaborates about the signs, about how to recognize each woman, what her character will be, what she'll sound like, how you're going to want to respond, and what you must do to avoid the wrong one and cling to the right. Solomon equips his son with the wisdom he will need when he meets them in real life. So when we know the story being told, and then come to the end of the book and we see the worthy or the virtuous woman in chapter 31, maybe now we have slightly different eyes for her. Yes, we should still look to her as the bedrock of biblical femininity, but we now see that she existed in Solomon's mind first in this snapshot of the ideal bride for his son. Maybe we're reminded of Abraham in Genesis 24 sending his servant to find a bride for his son Isaac, or Isaac in turn sending Jacob to find a wife in Genesis 28. These are good connections to make. But really, this is a glimpse into that truest of stories back of everything else. This is the picture of God the Father in eternity past considering his son Jesus, knowing he would be sent into the world to become the true king. The Father thought about the kind of man Jesus would come to be, what kind of king he would need to become, about the temptations Jesus would face, how he would avoid folly and every form of sin, how he would grow in wisdom and stature and favor with both God and man, and secure his perfect bride, the church. Remember that Jesus' marriage to the church is the template, the standard analogy for marriage in places like Ephesians 5. In fact, we could even read Proverbs 31 as being a prescription for the character and nature of the church that's presented spotless in Revelation 19, clothed in white linens, which are the righteous deeds of the saints. This is profound and it's beautiful. And hopefully, as we zoom back out to our discussion about understanding the Bible, we have a method for how to deal with poetry. Remember that poetry is a story frozen in time, so step into it and look around. See what it has to show you. How does it open your mind to think about reality? How does seeing it as a story help you understand some of the parts that once confused you? With any of the Bible's poems, you can walk through this process and ask, what's this story telling? Maybe it's something very specific, like David being pursued by Saul. Maybe it's something very broad, like God's entire relationship with Israel. Maybe it's the story of all that is from the earth's beginning to its fiery end. When you know the story you're in, it's so much easier to understand what's being said. Finally, though, remember that the whole Bible is telling you about Jesus. So any story you're dealing with will show you something about Jesus. And as Paul said, everything else in this life is rubbish compared to the surpassing worth of knowing Jesus, the King.
That was Trevor Trokey of Rapid City, South Dakota, presenting a special edition of Give Me the Bible. Trevor is one of two guest speakers hosted by the Rio Grande Valley Church of Christ today. Lord willing, Connor LaChapelle of Colorado Springs, Colorado, will preach during our 10 o'clock assembly this morning, and Trevor will once again preach during the 11:45 session. The Rio Grande Valley Church of Christ meets today and every Sunday at 75 Sherrod Boulevard, half a mile from Highway 47 near Belen and Rio communities. Come and be edified.